Hi, I'm Daniel, and I'm with my co-host George. Today we have Richard on. Richard, could you give us a little introduction of who you are and what you do?
Sure. Well, I used to be a soccer writer for a long time. I worked at the Score back in I guess I started in 2011, and I worked there for 3 years, and then I freelanced for quite a long time after that. And now have a day job writing. So my soccer days are now a little more amateur. But so I did a lot of stuff on soccer analytics when I was there because all of the people around me at the Score were analytics writers of various ilks. So I thought, well, I don't know anyone who's doing that in soccer at the time. So I started doing that, and it was right at the right time because the blog analytics scene was kind of exploding, and I made some interesting connections. And it was quite a heady time. It was a few trips to the Sloan Sports Analytics Conference in Boston, which was great. And yeah, it was great. And then in terms of Canadian soccer, and I guess this is more related to this topic, I also had a before I worked at the Score, I was writing a kind of a casual Canadian soccer history blog. And there was a guy named James Easton who picked it up, who was a former member of the Canadian national team. And he was asked by the Canadian Soccer Association to put together a feasibility study for a Canadian league, which eventually became the Canadian Premier League. But before that happened, we were like, well, we've tried this before and it's failed because we haven't actually created like a development infrastructure to sort of support something like the CPL. And you need that in place because it's very easy for owners to walk away if they have a product that is poor and not really connected to grassroots football. And they took our advice and they did it, and one of the results was obviously League1 Ontario. And so it was really wonderful to see Kyle Larin play and score in the Bosnian game because he was, I don't want to say he's a product of League1, but he's definitely a believer in League1, and I think it was important for him. So I have my fingers in a lot of pies, as it were, when it comes to Canadian soccer.
That's really interesting. But just to start, like first question, you obviously had a very interesting career, especially through like writing about football, soccer, and analytics, and going off of that. So like, how did you first like get started, and like what inspired you to keep going and keep writing more about soccer as your career progressed throughout the years?
Yeah, so before I started at the Score, I kind of was just doing it casually, and then it led to a few freelance gigs. So I wrote a bit for Toronto Life magazine, just a one-off feature article for them, and I did an article for the Globe and Mail. But there was a guy at the Score who liked my stuff and hired me on there, and I worked with people, I don't know, like people who know the Toronto sports scene will know people like Dustin Parks and Drew Fairservice and Andrew Stoughton, who's a big Jays writer, and so there were really really smart guys in that room. Justin Bourne, who I think is now like a Sportsnet analyst. So there's a lot of smart guys in that room, and a lot of people were interested in the role of analytics in their respective sports. But that was not something I knew anything about when it came to soccer. So, but I was pretty heavily online in that, in the online writing scene, and nobody else was talking about it either. So I kind of, around 2012, it felt like a really opportunity to like talk about this thing that's happening behind the scenes that nobody's really looking into. And it was really interesting. Like, I spoke with some people like Sarah Rudd, who was doing some work for a consultancy group that eventually, I guess, got purchased by Arsenal. Some other people, Ted Knutson, I spoke with him. Like, just anyone who's sort of like a semi-interesting player now in the analytics scene was sort of doing it at the amateur level then. So it was sort of like, but nobody else was talking to them. So I kind of carved out this niche, and it was great because before that I was sort of doing the day-to-day game stuff and the sort of drama stuff, and it can get repetitive. And this felt like it was actual reporting on stuff that nobody was talking about at the time, and I kind of got an audience for it, which was really, 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 really cool. Like even today, hearing Peter Drury talk about expected goals, which used to be just like something that a handful of nerds online were sort of talking about, and actually has roots in Canada because the precursor to that was like total shots ratio, which was a guy, a Canadian writer. I can't remember his name. I think his name was James Grayson. I don't remember. But anyway, there's some roots in terms of expected goals in hockey analytics and the old Oilers blogs and things like that. So it's just a really amazing time to get involved. And although I was only at the Score for about 3 years, I sort of built kind of a platform writing about analytics there.
Really cool.
Yeah, like this World Cup, so many people still don't know about expected goals. I've had to explain it probably 100 times just this month.
Yeah, it's not always
Yeah,
intuitive. Yeah, and I also think
yeah.
it's an abused stat, but that's a topic for another day.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're probably right. But then the next question we had was just kind of what was your main inspiration to behind creating and posting on Substack about pay to play and the issues that it's having in Canada and other countries like USA and Australia?
So that's a really good question. So a lot of it comes from, so after I stopped at the score, I freelanced a little bit, and I did some freelance writing for a consultancy group in the UK called 21st Club, which is run by Blake Wooster, is an amazing person. And so I wrote some stuff for them, freelance articles, and a lot of it was on player development and, things that a lot of countries sort of do wrong. But I think the reason for that post was because it was personal, because my son was a goalkeeper, and we had lived in Nova Scotia for 3 years during COVID, and had just come back to Toronto, and so my son joined an OPDL team, and so it was just really interesting to see up close and very personal, because my son was on the team, the actual inner workings of the Ontario Player Development League, at the youth level, right? So we're talking, I guess, you at the time was U14. And there were some things I thought were really strong. Like, obviously, I think the amount of talent that is on display, that even at the lower tier OPDL teams, is incredible. But, I also, on top of that, I saw teams making the same mistakes. And it was just interesting to look at, the teams, does winning, for example, correlate to producing more national team or more international professional players at the top tier? And I don't think it does, right? So that was kind of interesting. Although obviously I didn't do it in the most scientific way possible, just a cursory look at the sort of numbers of players that the top teams in OPDL produced. It doesn't really correlate, to the big star players that we associate with the national team, a lot of which played for, interestingly enough, Brampton FC, which I don't even think has their OPDL license anymore. So
yeah, I used to play a little bit for Brampton youth soccer team as well before the whole OPDL thing kind of blew up.
Yeah.
But I'm really happy that they started doing it. I think it's a really good thing that they started. But you kind of touched on it, like, how do you think the pay to play kind of hampers the people who even can afford to pay to play at that level? How do you think what holds them back even more at that level?
Yeah, I think rightly, when people talk about pay to play, their immediate reaction as well, it's inequitable, right? Because obviously, if you can't afford to put your kid in an academy development system, or if that's like a choice between that and affording to pay the rent or your car payment, then the choice is unfortunately clear. But at the same time, I don't think that tells the whole story, right? And I think part of the issue is that pay to play unfortunately encourages perverse incentives for teams that are, structured, at least on paper, about player development, right? And they tell you that, like, all the OPDL literature is very clear, where this is not about winning is great, but it's not the most important thing. What matters is developing players, right? And not necessarily for players who are going to play in Europe, but even, the chance of getting a D1 scholarship in the US, or, playing for college in Canada, or getting a shot at League1 Ontario or whatever. But the issue is, obviously, these clubs rely on registration fees to survive. And even though OPDL is very strict about geographic rules, we know how it works in theory. If a kid is good enough and they have the choice between, a Toronto High Park or North Toronto or Vaughan, which are, not that far apart from each other. And if they're gonna want to play for a Vaughan, right? Or they're gonna want to play for a Woodbridge, because those are obviously the most winning teams in the country. So the issue is that I think a lot of clubs, whether or not, they might try to deal with it, there's a lot of pressure there to pick kids at a certain age who might be better suited to winning at the U14, U13 level than kids who actually have long-term promise. And they've introduced like a second tier, like iModel, which I think is a good corrective to that. But I still think like there is a sense that iModel kids, which is the sort of tier below OPDL, and a lot of kids will play a year in OPDL, and they might not grow, or their skill might not have developed as fast in certain areas, and they might get told, all right, well, we don't have a space for you on the OPDL team, but you can play for the iModel team. But I think increasingly there's a sense among families that, despite what coaches are saying to parents, that once you're an iModel, you might get back in, you're kind of like, that's it, right? And I think this is not an issue that's just, isolated to Canada. And I think you could argue that Canada, I think reaching the round of 16 in this World Cup is already a proof that we're doing a lot of things right. I think we put in a much better match against Morocco than the US did against Belgium. And I would say those are probably teams of equal quality. So I don't want to crap on anything that we've done. And I do think that people, and I agree, like I've seen the quality of some of these kids, and I would say that there are very, very good players coming up in our system. I do think that there is this unfortunate issue with pay to play that is hard to get around, which is, again, teams that are supposed to be developing players focusing on, well, I'm going to look for the U14 kid who's 6 foot tall and can run really, really fast, as opposed to the U15 kid who's amazing on his feet, but needs a growth spurt. You know what I mean?
Yeah, our next question kind of like builds on points you mentioned, and something that kind of I haven't really thought about until I read your article, which is that parents don't really pay to develop their kids. They kind of pay for the team to win and the kid to win. So I was wondering how much of Canadian youth soccer do you think is shaped by the pressure to win instead of producing better players later on?
I think one of the big blind spots is OPDL sort of they've looked at the European academy system and they're like, well, we want to treat this as professionally as possible. We want a situation where kids are practicing 4 times a week, 5 times a week. They're having games every weekend, that they're doing strength training. So they're doing all the sort of right things. But there is a real sense that everyone knows the odds, right? What are you going to get out of this program? Well, chances are there may be one kid in an entire U15 team who might have an outside chance at receiving an academic scholarship, let alone even ever playing football, even at the semi-professional level, right? So I think part of the issue with the whole pay-to-play system, as you say, is I think they know that, and so if they're being realistic, they don't want their kid in an OPDL club that might be doing all the right things in terms of developing players, but might not be winning everything on the pitch. And they're realistically thinking, well, what is my kid going to get out of this? They're going to age out to 18, 19. They'll play amateur soccer with their friends for the rest of their life. Is this worth the amount of money that I'm paying into? And it probably isn't, right? So I think that's a good point. Like, it really reinforces this incentive that parents have to shop around, even though like it's officially against the rules. Again, because there's so many clubs in the GTA, it is theoretically possible for the parents of a very skilled soccer kid who might, be closer to Pickering to choose somewhere, again, like a Vaughan or a Woodbridge or Sigma or something like that. So yeah, I think, and again, I think part of the issue, and this goes back to what I said about iModel, is I think, part of what needs to be done is to say, we need to talk with parents, even parents of kids who are in OPDL, which is supposed to be the top tier. I'm just going to shut this. I'm looking bright here. Which is supposed to be the top tier. What are your lifelong options? What is the real incentive beyond obviously fitness and nutrition and exercise of paying, like, because we're talking like $6,000, and that's just the registration fees in some cases. That's a lot of money for, being told, well, your kid's not going to likely play beyond this, but they're going to be really, really fit. You know what I mean? I think that's not really a great incentive for a lot of parents to play. And I think there's also a bit of resentment of feeling like a lot of kids are just there because there's one good player. And sometimes you can tell there's entire OPDL teams where there's one player who's clearly going to go far, and the rest of the team essentially exists so that player has a team to play on. I mean, I hate to be crass, but that's kind of what it is.
Yeah. Well, just like obviously to piggyback onto some of the stuff you said, I even at my nephew, he plays like competitive here in London, plays for a smaller team here. And players, even at the age group he's at, I think it's under 12, they chop and change teams all the time. They go to the best teams that are winning the games all the time. Teams that are beating them, they switch over to play for them. I always found that interesting. I was like, I would think that you would want to stay with your club and develop and grow with your teammates and build that relationship, and then maybe later on in life move on. But I found it interesting that parents are more willing to chop and change and get their kid to play for the best team in their area before instead of sticking with a single team. Yeah, but to tag on to your more data analytical side, do you think it has a place in trying to improve the youth soccer in Canada at all? Or?
That is a good question. I'll be totally honest with you. I really don't think so. But that reflects my view on analytics, which is I think analytics unfortunately runs into the problem of Goodhart's law, which is, as soon as a measure becomes a target, so like something like expected goals. So if you see, well, we're shooting within the box,
Yeah.
and we're having a higher conversion rate to goals, we just need to take all of our shots within the box. But then that's something like a team can tactically adjust to, and you can often see that with a low block, right? So I think the problem with player analytics at the youth level is I don't always think that information is useful for developing players. I think that's not to say that stuff doesn't exist. I just think it's probably that's work probably being done at the University of Toronto, like at the Tannenbaum Institute for Science and Sport. I don't know that that's going to be something that will trickle down to the youth level anytime soon, because just in terms of basic advanced stats, my own view is that really only gives you a sense of like the overall health of your team. I don't know that that's something that would be useful in terms of like how to develop good soccer players. I think there's certain elements that you could figure out maybe by looking at analytics, like if you're doing rote exercises, right? Like there's this classic OPDL exercise that defenses do, which is, they'll rush out and hit a ball back as a foursome in the defense. And it's like, well, is that really the most useful thing for a defensive group to do for two center backs to be working on? I don't know that it is. So maybe there's something there in terms of like what's worth focusing on in terms of training. But I think at the youth level, it's really just comfort on the ball, vision and passing, the tempo, like, speed, tempo, football intelligence, like just this sort of basic stuff, right? Like, I don't think there's I think the area where analytics can be very, very useful, actually most useful, is the basic stuff. Like, for example, I talked earlier about the relative age effect, right? Which is, because we have this U14, U15 system, and again, because there's a bias to picking larger, more developed players, you end up picking players who are born earlier in the year, in January, February, right? Like this is a well-known effect. I think even Malcolm Gladwell wrote about this. So, that's not even really analytics. It's just like just an obvious bias you can correct for. So, grouping teams by developmental stage as opposed to age, right? Like that's like a really basic thing that a lot of teams haven't done. Like even in Europe, they haven't done it. I think maybe Germany or something has experimented with it, but that's not really a widespread thing. And that could be something, if Canada wanted to be ahead of the curve, we could certainly correct for.
Okay, cool.
Oh yeah. So one theme that me and George are interested in is that talent can exist in many places, but trust doesn't always travel equally. So we were wondering if you thought if there was any kind of evidence to make people believe in the player. That could be something like performance, club reputation data, referrals, physical profile, or something else entirely.
Yeah, I don't know. That's like, I think there's a professor at U of T, Joseph Baker, who's looked into all this sort of thing, and he would probably have a better answer than I do, because I don't
No
know.
worries.
But, in baseball, it's amazing, right? Because there's discrete events, and I remember going to the Sloan conference, and there would be these amazing papers about, we hitting for power is like a really good future predictor, but in terms of like youth football, I think Landon Donovan even said it. He looked at a study that looked at kids who were sort of seen and objectively seen as the best, most likely kids to become professionals at the U12 level, for example. The correlation between those kids and those and scouts identifying those kids and their actual professional careers is zero, right? This is like what he was pointing out. So I think that's something analytics could absolutely look into. Again, it's just, I think we run into this issue of, because of the nature of football, it's something where you're looking into very, very, very precise, high-tech, hard to gather, expensive data that is usually only the purview of teams with already a ton of money, not your average OPDL side in like Etobicoke. You know what I mean? So that's the issue. How do you bridge the gap between, like, yes, there's probably very, very interesting things that can be understood through player tracking, movement tracking, but the infrastructure to collect that data is super expensive. And I just don't know that the return ultimately would be worth it. I think you just have to accept that, like, player development, I've always said this, it's a numbers game. You just want as many kids playing for as long as possible. And that's really all there is to it. It's a big filter. It's like a Plinko board. And you don't necessarily know at the U12 level who's going to end up at the end. You can start to see it U15, U16, but even then, it's not always a guarantee.
Yeah, fully agree. Yeah, it was really good, really insightful, and we really appreciate having you and being here with us and talking to us. Your experience is a lot more than than we expected. And the places you've been at, the things you've written about, the people you've worked with, and their influence on the game in Canada as well is really great. And we're really happy to have you on. Just one last thing I wanted to ask, or we wanted to ask, is like, in your opinion, if there was like one or many things that you could add or change about Canadian youth development right now that you think would take us a little bit further, what do you think would it be?
Yeah, if you had like a magic wand.
Oh man, oof. Well, I think more, this sounds silly, but I think more clubs, like, and more
Yeah.
places to play, right? I think a lot of people are wary of, the alternative to pay to play is the government pays a lot of money for soccer infrastructure. And I think a lot of people sort of roll their eyes because it's already hard enough to get the government to fund things that we actually need, let alone, youth football. But I do think that, it's a lot easier to keep kids who, in the game if there's more places for them to play, right? And I think, one of the interesting things about OPDL is you just realize, well, there's just not enough teams. It's really, really difficult. And what if you're born in Thunder Bay? What do you do then? What if you're playing soccer and you're in Kapuskasing, you know what I mean, or rural Manitoba. And so I really think, although we've come super far in terms of our development pathway, I think it's a bit like we need to have a bit more, and we also need to realize, if we have more, it can't just be, we also have to realize, well, who's going to be coaching these kids, and how do we get eyeballs on them, and how do we make sure that they're coaching kids the right way, and what role can the CSA play in terms of educating amateur parent coaches, and because ultimately that's who's going to have to run the show, a lot of this stuff. So I think that's a big part of it. And I think, like I said before, I think looking at better trade-offs for parents of the kids who are in the elite development leagues to say what's going to keep them playing, what's really the quid pro quo here, in terms of like, these parents are paying so much for their kids, and if they're just there to support the one kid who's actually going to go pro, and they're not going to get anything out of it once they're 18, 19, then it seems to me kind of a failure. So I think addressing that gap, right? And how do we do that? Maybe we need more Sunday league football in Canada, organized Sunday league football or something like that. But I don't have a panacea. I just think there's little things that we could do. But again, we're on a good pathway here. We just have to keep going a little bit.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think the Canadian Premier League being where it's at right now and being a professional league is a huge step forward. And also with like the draft and having youth sports players get drafted into the league. And I think I've seen also they have some academy teams for some of the teams in the league as well. That is a huge step forward, and it goes a long way to helping improving and helping giving access to players to get into a professional environment in general. But I
Yeah.
completely agree with what you were saying. So yeah,
It's just wild to me because I helped write parts of that report, and I was like, well, the CSA will never do this, and then they did it. You know what I mean? So I think that the fact that happened to me felt like a miracle, 15 years ago, and the fact that we can point to it and say, look, this is having a return, I think is an incredible thing. So things can change very, very quickly. Canada was ranked 100th back in like 2010.
Yeah, I remember.
Yeah.
We lost, we had to beat, what was it, Honduras away, and we lost 8-1 or whatever. Like the national team was shambles. And a big part of it was, although we had individually talented players, like, we had Atiba Hutchinson, who's now in the TSN panel, they just never played together. It was just two big egos that were too far apart, and I think we've really corrected for that now, and you're seeing the results. So it's good.
All right. Again, just want to thank you so much, Richard, for being here with us and taking the time to speak with me and Daniel. We really appreciate it, and we really appreciate the insight you've given us today and all the knowledge you've given us as well. Your experience is very vast and very, very, very cool. It's very nice talking to you. And
Thank you.
Likewise.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it. All right, that's gonna be all. I think that's all the questions we have for you.
Yeah,
thank
all
you
good.
for speaking with us again. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah. Hopefully we can keep in contact and speak in the future as well.
Yeah, I'd love to.
Something
Well,
that's okay.
send me emails if you have questions about anything. I can help you out for sure.
Thank you.
All right,
Thank you.
cheers.
All right, Richard, have a
Bye.
great evening. He's cool as hell, bro. That dude is super cool.